Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I want to talk about a subject that I've wondered, and I know a lot of other fans have wondered, ever since the Buu saga of Dragon Ball Z. And that would have to be something revolving around Fat Majin Buu. More specifically, what were to happen if the Supreme Kais that are currently inside of Buu were to be removed? With that being the Daikaioshin and possibly the Southern Supreme Kai, as I mentioned in a video that you could see down below in the description and on my channel about what happened to the Southern Supreme Kai. But what exactly would happen to Buu if you took these other Kais out of him? Well, let me get into the manga and talk a little bit about what exactly happened with Buu and those Kais being inside of him, and then we'll get into that discussion. So for recap, as we know, during the Buu saga, when Goku and Vegeta had fused into Vegito and were dominating Super Buuhan, they decided on a plan in which they would go inside of Buu's body, as you could see here, and then go about releasing all of their friends who were inside of pods inside of his body. However, one thing they didn't account for is that they had found Fat Buu inside of him as well. And this must have happened after the skinny Buu, Gray Buu, or whatever you want to call him, decided to turn this Fat Buu into chocolate. Instead of just eating and digesting him like he did the others, wiping them out in the process, he did in fact incorporate Buu in a pod in his body, which allowed him to transform into Super Buu, taking all the power, the essence, and everything that's in Fat Buu without really any of the weaknesses and harnessing that to its maximum potential, which I also talked about in another video. Wow, I reference a lot of videos in these. But nonetheless, what ended up happening? Well, as we would see in time, Vegeta would go and proceed to take this Buu, Fat Buu, out of Super Buu. And this is what led to Buu reverting back into, let's go to see what happens, his previous stages of the absorptions that he had. For example, he regressed back through the stage in which KID BUU had absorbed the Southern Supreme Kai. And that's why he became larger, his body became more muscular, and as Goku said, he looked like he was taking roids. And at this point, he continued to regress because he no longer had the impact or anything with regard to Fat Buu and the Kais inside of him playing a part on his body, until, of course, he went back to the purest form of all, the original Buu of KID BUU, pure Buu, the pure evil Aku Buu that we see right here. And this is the point where Supreme Kai explains that there used to be a number of other Lord of Lords, for the other four that is, the Grand Supreme Kai, the Daikaioshin, the Kaioshin and others, but of course, Buu had killed two of them, and then he went on to absorb the Southern Supreme Kai, and eventually the Fat Supreme Kai. And as you can see right here, this Daikaioshin, the Great Lord of Lords, as they call him in the manga, is the one that looks the most like Fat Buu, because the fact that when Buu absorbed him, as you can see over here on the left, it tamed him, it changed him significantly on a fundamental level because of the good-hearted nature and the gentle spirit of the Fat Buu, of the Fat Kai rather, which created Fat Buu, which had the full control over Buu, and additionally, not just that, but it also limited his power and the malice that he could put out comparative to when he was Super Buu, and especially KID BUU, who isn't really limited by any of these things. So as we know, when you remove Fat Buu and the other influences from Buu, you get KID BUU, the true original one, before he has any of the other things stacked on top of him. Kind of like how Frieza regresses from his form that we initially see him in back to his base form, with those transformations serving to limit him. In a similar way, so too does that happen with Super Buu, Fat Buu, and so on, other than KID BUU. The only thing I would say is that with regard to Super Buu is that when Evil Buu, the Wrath Buu, Gray Buu, took over him, he was able to suppress the influence of this Kai so that he no longer was limited in terms of his power, which is why, many people have said over the years, and there's definitely a great argument to say, this one isn't as powerful, but he definitely is more dangerous, as they say here, the most difficult one, because of his lack of remorse, because of the fact that all he cares about is destruction, having fun, doing things like that, and basically seems to have infinite stamina, among other things. And there's no real influence or impact that we see on KID BUU, with the exception of later on when he goes to fight against Mr. Satan. when Mr. Satan comes on to fight him, and what happens? Well, Kid Buu is holding back against what he actually wants to do, against his own wishes, because Fat Buu is still inside of him, having a very slight impact on what he could do, specifically in terms of Mr. Satan. Until, of course, Kid Buu finds out how to channel him into his mouth, I guess you could say, and spits him out like a piece of gum and separates him. So at this point, we know that Fat Buu and Kid Buu are not the same Buu. They are not the same being. They are completely separate. So even when Kid Buu is eventually wiped out, Fat Buu still remains. So the question becomes, what exactly happens to cause not only the separation, but also what would happen if there was an additional separation with these Buus? Well, I think that what might have happened is that over the millions of years that Buu was sealed away inside of his shell and basically became pure energy, pure smoke, whatever he was in there, that is what caused the full true merging and combination of the other Kais within him. The Grand Supreme Kai, or Daikaio Shin, the Southern Supreme Kai, merging within him in a sense to where he became this separate being. So it is possible that at this point, even though we do go on later to see the Grand Supreme Kai taking over the body through the consciousness that becomes Fat Buu, the question is at that point, are they really separate anymore? Or is this one being now, and it really is the Daikaio Shin, maybe Supreme Kai from the South, just with Buu's DNA and with like new memories and possibly a new soul? A question in of that self right there. And if that is the case, or maybe even isn't the case, what would happen if they were to actually be removed from him? Would they go back to being these Kais right here? As in, let's say that Vegeta in Dragon Ball Super were to use his Force Spirit Fission ability that he learned in the Moro arc, in which he was able to separate someone who is fused together. He could possibly separate Potara fusion. They even referenced that he could separate the biological fusion of Kami and Piccolo, and possibly even Nail, I'm assuming so as well. So at that point, if he could remove them from one another and separate them back into their individual forms, certainly he'd be able to do so here. Same thing would have to be the case possibly with the Dragon Balls. Like if Buu said, okay, I'll let you use the Dragon Balls on me to separate me, maybe it would negate his power difference between him and the God of the Earth and the Guardian, and then in turn be able to do that. Or they could use the Super Dragon Balls, which would, make it irrelevant, because the fact that the Super Dragon Balls seemingly can grant literally any wish, even undoing what Zeno, the highest god that we know at the time, was capable of doing. So if that were to happen, would Fat Buu cease to exist? Would he no longer be Buu at all? Or would this, as we see right here, Kid Buu, a different version of him maybe, exist instead? Maybe Kid Buu basically duplicated, but when all of this occurred. However, the fact of the matter is that he wouldn't be the truly malevolent evil Buu that we had seen before. He would rather be, a version of Kid Buu that was nicer, that was friendlier, that had the personality of Fat Buu inside of him. And at the same time, too, if that is the case, what happens with Oob? We saw in Dragon Ball GT, for example, that Fat Buu and Oob merged together to reunite once and for all to become Majoob or Super Oob or whatever you'd like to call them, depending upon the different version or translation. So is it possible that there actually could be more than one iteration of Buu simultaneously with a Kid Buu? That would be the new version of Buu and Oob. I mean, wow, Buu is so complicated. I feel like I need a degree in quantum mechanics just to completely understand everything about this guy. But nonetheless, what would happen? Well, I think that really comes down to whether or not Buu is truly separate from these Kais now. Would Buu be a separate being and these two would be separate beings, or perhaps because they did fully merge together, they are no longer able to actually be separate beings. They're only one being now, which is Fat Buu. and then of course you can't truly separate him? That's a question I'd love to hear. You guys speculate on down below in the comments and let me know, because it is one of the biggest what ifs, I suppose, in the Dragon Ball franchise. Now, of course, as is the case with a lot of the different things that we see in Dragon Ball Super and the modern Dragon Ball, until they go past this end of Z, where we could see right here that takes place 10 years after the events of the Buu saga, where everything takes place after Dragon Ball Super, nothing really is probably going to happen with Buu in that regard, because the fact that we still see him right here as Mr. Buu. He is alongside Mr. Satan, constantly helping him to be able to stay the champion, because Buu gets to the finals and then throws the fight every single time, so Mr. Satan can keep his power. Talk about being a great friend for Buu there. And on top of that, you know, if this does tend to happen, or somehow does happen before the true end of Z, then we would have to assume that either they go back to being Fat Buu once again, or perhaps instead they end up, you know, not changing his full identity whatsoever. So that's just something to keep in mind. But alright guys, what do you think? Do you think that if Fat Buu were to have the Kais removed from him right now, after the Buu saga, that he would cease to exist, that he'd become another Kid Buu, or something entirely different might happen altogether? Let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. Also, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.